Hello, my name is Marissa Muskie, and today I'll be teaching you how to make these puffy stars, and specifically how to make them into little keychains. So let's dive right in. Alright, first things first, let's go over materials. So you'll be needing a beading needle and some thread. I usually grab about 12 to 15 inches per side, and that is usually enough to get me through, but obviously if you do more rows you will probably need some more thread, so just be aware of that. You'll also need some polyfill or stuffing of your choice, and then you'll also need whatever color of beads you want. I'm going to be using these three, so yellow, red, and blue. I'll be using the red for the herringbone stitch on the edges, the yellow for the peyote stitch in between, and then the blue to show you where the sewing should start and stop. And then I think that is all you will need. So let's go right into row number 1. Alrighty, so to start row number 1, you'll want to pick up 4 beads. And this will be the start of our herringbone, so that's why I have the red here. And you want to pull it to the end of your string and leave about like a 4 to 5 inch tail, just so that you are able to sew that in later. And then here you can see I'm going back in, so the end of my tail is coming out here. We're just going to make a circle back through those beads, and you just go all the way through. I like to do this 2 times to make it a little bit more secure. So again, we made that circle. We're going to go back through these 4 beads again. And then to make this turn into a square, we're just going to go through the first bead to make one last circle and pull our thread all the way through. And now you can see that has made a square, and that will be our first row. Alrighty, now we're on to our second row. So you'll want to be coming out like this. And this is going to be another row of just the herringbone stitch, so we're just continuing on. So I'll pick up 2 of my red beads. And essentially to do the herringbone stitch, you just take your 2 beads and then go through the next one in your row. And you'll notice they kind of want to stick up like that. You can just flatten them out. Your fingers, sometimes it likes to stick, sometimes it doesn't. There we go. So those are now flat, and then we can move on to the next set. So I'm going to pick up 2 beads and go through the next one. Just pull that straight on through. And again, they don't want to lay flat, so we gotta make them lay flat. We turn it again. And this will be another herringbone stitch. Grab 2, go through the next. And sorry, I had a bit of a tangle there. So you just pull it on through. And then it's not necessarily an issue if they don't lay flat, because you can always rearrange them. I just find it a little bit easier to do it early on, so that way hopefully they kind of stick that way. But you can always do it later. And then we're on our last stitch. So we're going to grab 2 beads. And instead of just going through the next one, you can see we have 2 beads here. So to complete the row, we have to do what's called stepping up. So we will go through not just the first bead, but the second one as well. We just go through those 2. That way we end up on the outside of that row where we would want to be. And then you can just pull that on through. Not to get twisty, but here we go. So this would be our second row. And as you can see, if you're ever wondering where you are ending up, you can just count how many rows of the herringbone stitch that you have. and that should be how many rows in you are. So let's move on to the third row. All right, we're on the third row. And again, you see that we are on the herringbone side of things. So to do our herringbone stitch, we just want to pick up 2 beads and go through the next bead that's right next to the one that you're coming out of. And then you'll see that we have this space in between. So like before, we were going just through this herringbone stitch and coming out with 2 beads. However, this is actually going to be the start to our peyote rows. So I'm going to grab a yellow bead. We only need 1, and you'll go through the next bead over here and pull it on through. So if you're ever not quite sure where you're coming out of, they kind of will go up and down. You'll just want to find where the space is in between and go through there. So I'll show you again on this one. So we're back at the herringbone stitch. So just go through the next bead in your row and pull it on through. Once you've pulled that through, you'll see that there is a gap in between. To fill in that gap, we'll use a yellow bead for the peyote row. Go through the bead right next to it and pull that tight. Okay, we're back at the herringbone part. So just go through the next bead where you're coming out of, pull it through, flat there. And then you'll want to fill in that gap with the peyote bead. So skip the one below there and go through the next. Pull that through. We have one more herringbone. Just go into the next bead. Pull that tight. Grab one peyote bead. And this is the same as we did in the last row. So instead of going in through just one of the next row of herringbone, we'll go through 2 beads. So not 1, but 2. And this is our stepping up row. And then we pull that through nice and tight. And that is our 3rd row. Alrighty, so we're going to move on to our 4th row here. So, much like the last one, we're going to start with the herringbone stitch. So go through the bead right next to the one you're coming out of after picking up 2 beads. And then once you pull that tight, you'll see that we actually have 2 gaps this time. So one right here and one right here. And they're right next to that initial peyote bead that we laid down. So we'll grab just one of our yellow beads and go through that bead that we just did the peyote stitch on for the last row and pull it through. Now we're coming out that previous peyote bead. We're going to go back through to enter the next herringbone stitch and pull that through with just one yellow bead. You'll see that we're kind of creating that same kind of up and down for if we wanted to add more rows. Let's flip this around. Pick up 2 beads because we're back at the herringbone area and go through the one right next to the one you're coming out of. Pull tight. And we're back at the peyote section. Pick up one yellow bead. Put your needle through the previous yellow bead that you just laid down and pull it tight. Pick up one more yellow bead and put it through the row of herringbone that you're going to be coming out of next row, but all right, we're back at the herringbone. So 2 more red beads, go through the next one, pull through. Grab 1 more yellow bead, put it through the previous row's yellow bead. And pull that through. Grab another yellow bead and put it through the previous row's herringbone right next to it. Alright, and we have just 1 more herringbone for this row, so 2 red beads, put it through the next bead, herringbone. Then grab 1 yellow bead, put it through the yellow bead of the previous row. Pull it tight. And grab 1 more yellow bead. And this is going to be the stepping up part. Once we have completed this row, or well, we will have completed this row after this one. And go through 2 beads. Pull that tight. And you'll notice this is kind of wanting to bend all over the place. It's kind of a lopsided square. This is what we want because this is actually going to, if we fold this like a diamond kind of, we're actually going to sew this together with our other sections, and this will make one part of the point of our star. With that being said, let's move on to the last row of this section. Alright, so we're on our 5th and final row. This is just going to be the row for sewing the whole thing together. You could technically stop before this, but I like to do them 5 rows long because I feel like that's a decent size to land on. So, since we're doing this whole thing as a sewing row, I'm actually going to be just using blue beads on this row. So, even though we're on the herringbone part, since we want to sew this all together, I'm just going to be picking up 1 bead. And just like the herringbone that we did before, I'm going to put it through the next bead, that row. And this is kind of just filling in the gaps of where you see beads to kind of slot in here. I'll pick up 1 more blue bead, go through the next yellow bead of the previous row, and pull that tight. 1 more bead. I see this empty space here in between 2 yellows we had just put down. So I'll go through the next one and pull it tight. And we actually have 1 more space to fill in here, and that's between this yellow bead and then this red bead of the previous herringbone stitch. So we're going to go through that first red bead that you see there. Pull that tight. And then we've kind of filled in all the gaps. So, much like we just did, pick up 1 blue bead and go through the next bead in your herringbone stitch. Go through. Another blue bead. And go through the next yellow bead that you see. Filling in that gap there. We're going to fill in this gap. So go in through the next yellow bead of the previous row and pull that tight. Another blue bead and go through the first bead of the herringbone stitch on the previous row. 2 sides done. And grab another blue bead, just one, and go through the next stitch of the herringbone on the previous row. Grab another blue bead, go through the yellow on the previous row, fill that gap in. I'm gonna fill the gap in with another blue bead here, so in between the 2 yellow beads. Grab another blue bead and go through the first herringbone bead on the previous row. Flip it around. Grab another blue bead, go through the next herringbone bead on the previous row. Tight. Another blue bead, go through the next yellow bead. Another blue bead. The blue, I'm sorry. Go through the yellow bead after that. Grab one more blue bead. And this will be the row where we're doing the step up since we've just finished. So go through the first red bead and then also through the blue one that we had just laid down to start off the row and pull that through. So again, you want to go through this red bead as well as the blue one and pull tight. And then you're pretty much done with this section. You just need to tighten or tie your ends in. I like to go through the first 3 beads over here, and then kind of had that little circle in the beginning, so I kind of like to just go back through there. Go around in a little circle. And also feel free to turn your work as many times as you need. I feel like it's easier to turn it so I can kind of see where I'm ending up. Go through the circle and then I go back out where I came. And just to make sure nothing falls out of place, I just go through that blue bead and then back through like 3 of the herringbone stitch. I find the herringbone stitch is easiest to go back through, so that's usually what I end up doing. And then we can kind of just snip that part off. So there is our square. And then you can do the same with this tail. I usually just leave them on because I think it's a little bit easier to sew everything in once I have a few sides established, but yes. And then when you fold it, it should just look like this. So we will sew the rest of our sides onto here. Before you start on your other sides, please stop at row 4 because we have to sew these together. So I'll show you how to do that. But feel free to copy up until row 4 and you should be good to go. And I'll be right back to show you how to sew these all together. Alright, we're back. So as you can see, I stopped at 4 rows. And again, if you're not quite sure where you're at, just count how many rows of herringbone stitch you have, which from the center goes 1, 2, 3, 4. So we are good to stop here. So for the sewing part, the first thing I actually do, just to make this a little bit easier on myself later on, is I take my end from the beginning and I just push it through the other side. So that way I can start sewing like this. I just find it's a little bit easier to wrap my way around on this side rather than on the other one. It just makes a little more sense to me. But now we are ready to sew this side and our previous one together. So we're going to pick up one blue bead for the sewing part and put it through the previous row of herringbone and pull that tight. And then we're going to take the last piece that we made and we're going to, instead of filling in these gaps right here with more beads, we're just going to sew those together. They should slot together kind of like that. This is a little bit easier to do when kind of sandwich them together. So we're skipping this one. That's just the point of the last row. And then we'll go through the next blue bead. So we go through the blue bead on there. And like I said, we're filling in the gaps. So that blue bead will fill in this gap on this side here. We're going to go through the yellow side we just made. And then here's our gap in between those two. We're going to go through this blue bead and pull that tight. The next gap to be filled in would be right here. We're going to go through this yellow bead. This should essentially be kind of like a zipper. So each slot needs to fill in one on the other side of the piece. So we're filling in this gap right here. So we're going in through the next blue bead on our previous part. And then we're going to go through the red bead to fill in this gap right here. And pull that tight. Now we have landed at a point, but since this is going to be one of the outer points of our stars, we're not going to add another bead. We're just going to go through the one at the top here. So put this into perspective here. You can kind of see this on one that's already formed. The white beads in this case are the blue beads here. So the 2 points right here would be these 2 white beads on this star. And then you can see the seam. And the top only has 1 white bead. The top here should only have 1 blue bead. So once you put that all together, I'll kind of show you again. But we'll go through the blue bead at the top, pull that tight. And now this is kind of starting to take shape. So I want to go through the red bead to fill in this slot right here. Fill in this gap. We'll go in through this blue bead. Fill in this gap. We'll go in, to fill in the gap in between these blue beads, we're going to go in through this yellow one. Fill in the gap between these 2 yellow beads. We'll go in through this blue one. And you should be kind of seeing the spaces in between. but in essence, like I said before, it should be kind of like a zipper. Fill in the gaps between these two blue beads. Go in through this yellow one. Get tight. Then we have a gap in between this yellow and this red. So we'll go through this blue bead. And then to finish off the zippering together, you'll just go through the red bead. So that's going to lead us through the herringbone on the previous row of that side. You can see it's kind of all zippered together, and it doesn't really look like how I do it in the shorts. I find it's a little bit cooler to kind of pull it apart and just yoink it together. But yeah, and then we also need to create a zipper on this side for when we put our next piece onto here. So much like you did with the first piece, grab one blue bead and go through the next bead on previous row's herringbone. That's getting kind of hard to differentiate all of this. You want to fill in that gap between the red bead that you came out of and the yellow bead on the previous row. So grab another blue bead, go through the yellow and pull tight. Grab one more blue bead, fill in this gap here between the two yellows. Grab another blue bead, fill in this gap between this yellow and this red, and pull that tight. Now we're at a corner, so fill in this corner between the two herringbone beads. We'll just grab a blue bead and go through the next herringbone bead, pull it tight. Grab another blue bead, fill in the gap between the red and the yellow here. Grab another blue bead, fill in the gap between these two yellow beads. I'm going right here. And then we have one more gap to fill in. So one more blue bead, fill in the gap between the yellow you're coming out of and the next red on that herringbone stitch. Pull that tight. Now you have your first two rows. And much like in the previous part of this project, to fasten it off, I will just circle through the herringbone stitch a couple of times and then just snip it off. Alright, here is our two sides sewn together with the tails weaved in. So you can kind of see in comparison to this star where we're at. So it should start looking like this. And again, the white beads are similar to the blue beads, and those are where you need to be stitching things together. If you do want to work ahead, it's pretty much more of the same. You'll just need 3 more pieces, and for your last one, instead of adding an extra row of zippering, you just zipper everything together, because there should be beads available to you on all sides in order to do that. Otherwise, I will be showing you how to do that last side just in case, as well as a loop for how to add your keychain. So I will see you back in 3 more sides. Alright, we're now to our last, 5th and final section. So this is essentially we're going to be just zippering everything up. We will be adding 2 blue beads for our little inner corners here, but that's pretty much it. So to do this part, just like we did before, I'm going to move the thread to the back just to make it a little bit easier on myself. Take one blue bead and add it to the herringbone bead next to the one I'm coming out of and pull that through. Right, now that we have that bead there, we're just going to pick any side and sandwich them together just like we did on the last one. And we have our inner corner bead here, so we're going to go through the next blue bead, which is right here. Kind of got wrapped up a little bit. We're back on track. Filling in the gaps. We want this blue bead to go in between this gap. We'll go in through the yellow one on this side. We're back to picking up a blue bead, so we have the next one up right here. Going through that one. And then to fill in the gap between those blues, we're going to go in through the next yellow one on this side. Fill in this gap here. I'm going to go through this blue bead. Right. And then we'll go through the top red bead over here since this blue is filling in that gap. Right. Go in through this blue bead since that's going to be our point on that side. And then we have much of the same here. So typically when I'm sewing these together, instead of going one by one, I'll actually go through two at a time, just because I think that makes it a little bit quicker. So I want this red to go in between this gap and this blue to go in between this gap right here. So I will just go through the red and then the blue. Like I said, this should be kind of like a zipper. We've gone through those two. I want this yellow to go in between these two blue beads. I want this blue bead to go in between these two yellow. So I go in through the yellow, then in through the blue, and pull that through. And then again, we want to fill in this gap here. Lines up with this yellow bead. And this gap here between this yellow and this red, do that blue bead. So I will go in through this yellow and in through this blue on this side. We don't want to loop the thread around. And just pull that tight. Put all zippers together, and then we just have this red bead left to fill in the gap between those two blues. So we will pull our thread through there, and when we flip it around, and tighten it a little bit, and see we just have this side left to sew together. So when pick up one blue bead, this will be going in between the herringbone stitch for the last row. And that will be our inner point. And you'll notice sometimes this wants to come loose. Just pull it tight and you should be a-okay. It's kind of hard to sandwich the last row together, but as you can see, it's kind of a zipper, like I said before, so you should kind of be able to see the gaps. So this is where I particularly find going in through 2 to be useful because it kind of establishes and gets this strengthened a little bit more. I know I want the blue bead to go in between those 2. And the yellow bead should be going in between those 2 blues. This blue lines up with this gap here, and this yellow lines up with this gap between the 2 blues. So I go in through this blue and in through this yellow. Stitch them together. And we have this gap here between this yellow and this red. And then this gap here between these 2 blues. So I will go through 1 blue and that red. And if you find it easier to stitch one by one, feel free to do that. I just like to do the 2 beads at a time because I think that's just a little bit easier for me. So you'll notice we haven't filled this up with polyfill yet. That's because now is the time. So before we do that, I will say that I like to add a few more stitches here. So I'll go through that top blue bead. And then again, there's this gap here. And this gap between the red and the yellow. I'm just going to go through those 2. The reason I do that is because it's kind of difficult to stitch these together with the polyfill inside. I use my handy little bead scoop that has tweezers on the end to fill in the polyfill in these stars to like stuff them. So I find that makes it a lot easier to get the stuffing where I need it to go. But you might need a bigger gap if you're just using your fingers. Otherwise, you can also use needle nose pliers. I think those work pretty well too. It kind of allows you to stuff everything in between these corners here. But if you are just using your fingers, you might want to leave a few extra stitches open. That way you can kind of shove stuff in a little bit better. But now that we have that, I'm just going to take some polyfill, and you don't need very much. And I kind of like to roll it in between my fingers, make like a little ball. Take that in between my tweezers. And then just shove it in. So I'm going to take a little bit more this time. Again, rolling it up in my hand. Grabbing it with my tweezers. You can kind of see it's like sticking out a little bit at the top. What you can do is take your tweezers and grab that stuff at the top and just shove it back into the star. Part of the reason I like to make those small little pieces of stuffing into a ball because it's a little bit easier to put in the corners specifically. And I like to have puffy corners. So, shoving that in, make sure we get all our corners. And then I'm just going to add a little bit extra for this last corner that we're going to be sewing up. We kind of want to shove it to the back. Because although we also want this corner to be puffy, we don't want it to like get in the way of our sewing too much. We kind of shove that back. And this might loosen a little bit while you're doing this. So you can just tighten it again, no big deal. And so I like to pinch these 2 sides together, make it a little bit easier on myself. So yellow bead to fill in the gap between these 2 blues, and then we'll go in Next blue bead, fill in the gap between those two yellows. And then if you keep noticing it's poking out, like I said, stuff it back in. Alright. We want this yellow to go in between the two blues, and this blue to go in between that yellow and that red. So we go through that yellow and through that blue. And then lastly, to fill in the gap between right here, blue and blue, we go in through this red. Right here. Right. And there we go. Everything is all sewn together. And pretty much what you'd want to do after that, like we did in all our previous rows, and all our previous pieces, I mean, is just circle back through the herringbone. That way you don't have to worry about knotting everything off. And that's pretty much where you'd end it if you just wanted a star. But I said in the beginning, we actually are making this into a keychain. So what we're going to do instead is, now that we've circled back through that bead and up through the herringbone, we come out right here. So as long as you're coming out of one of these initial rows of one of your pieces, you should be good to go. So no worry if you went a little too far. And then you basically go back up through herringbone on this side. And where you want to end up is basically at any of these points. So any of these blue beads will do just fine. And then just go through that blue bead. So now we're coming out of the top right here. And then to make my loop, I think I'm just going to do it with blue beads. I'm going to do 11 beads, just because I feel like that will make a decently sized loop. There we go. And if you want to, I would add a keyring right now, just because that's probably going to make it a little bit easier instead of hooking everything up. But if you forget, you can just add it on later. No big deal. As long as you have the loop in place, you should be good to go. So we're coming out of this bead on that side. What you essentially want to do is create a circle. We're going to go back through the opposite side of where we're coming out of and pull it tight. See, that made a circle. And then we just want to go back through that loop 2 or 3 times just to make sure it's nice and stable. Two would probably be fine, but I'm going to go through it 3 times just in case. Perfect. Okay, now we're out of that bead. So, like you did on the other rows, just sew your tail in through the herringbone side. Make sure to pull it tight. That way everything is good to go. Now snip that off. And then I'm gonna weave this end in and then I will be right back. Alright, here's our keychain. All the ends are weaved in and everything. So if you do notice any like fluffiness on either side poking out that you don't want to, just feel free to take little scissors and snip it off. Otherwise, another method I have used before is if you want to sew a very tiny pillow to put inside, that works too. Kind of keeps it from spilling out. Just make sure that you have a nice colored fabric to put inside that matches whatever bead pattern you're using. But otherwise, yeah, this one is good to go. If you do have any questions, feel free to let me know in the comments below. I'll do my best to answer. I know this pattern's kind of confusing, but yes, I hope that explained it well enough. And then if you do want to make any bigger ones of these, just don't stop at 4 rows. Keep going until you get the desired length that you want. And then just add the sewing row on as your last one. And follow the same exact steps. You should be a-okay. But yes, here we are. Thank you all so much for watching. I appreciate it as always. And I will see you later. Bye.